The first time I pretended to be in a relationship, I thought it would last less than 30 seconds. Just enough to help a woman escape a situation that had clearly gone too far. I never expected that one impulsive sentence spoken beside a crowded neighborhood grocery store would begin changing the quiet life I had spent years carefully keeping small. Looking back now, I realize the moment she looked at me and chose to believe my lie was the moment everything started to change for both of us. Before that afternoon, my world was simple in the safest and loneliest possible way. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 36, I restore old houses for a living, and I live in a brick apartment building in a small Oregon neighborhood where everyone knows which porch belongs to which family. The work suits me because old wood doesn't ask questions, and damaged things can often be repaired if you're patient enough. People are harder. 3 years earlier, my fiancée left 2 months before our wedding after deciding she wanted a life filled with travel, expensive restaurants, and opportunities that didn't include a man who spent his days covered in sawdust. Since then, I'd convinced myself that being dependable was useful, but not particularly lovable. Across the hall from me lived Emma Collins, and if anyone had asked, I would have said we were simply friendly neighbors. She taught second grade at the elementary school 5 blocks away and somehow carried sunshine with her wherever she went. Every morning she left with a canvas tote full of papers to grade, and every evening she returned with stories about children who had lost teeth, learned multiplication, or cried because their classroom goldfish looked lonely. We shared occasional dinners when one of us cooked too much, traded books through the mail slot between our apartments, and watered each other's plants during vacations. She had a gentle laugh that made even ordinary conversations feel worth having, but I had long ago filed my feelings for her in the category of things that were better left untouched. Emma had her own reasons for keeping people at a distance. She rarely talked about her past, but I knew enough to understand that someone had hurt her badly. Once, during a thunderstorm that knocked out power in the building, she admitted that she had been engaged before and discovered, only weeks before the wedding, that the man she trusted had been seeing someone else for more than a year. She said it quietly, without anger, which somehow made it sound even sadder. After that, she focused on her students, her books, and the comfortable routines of a life that asked very little from anyone else. The afternoon everything changed was a warm Saturday in early June. I had spent the morning repairing window frames in a Victorian house on Maple Street and stopped at Miller's Market to buy coffee and groceries on my way home. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed Emma standing near the flower display outside the store. At first nothing seemed unusual, but then I saw the man beside her. He was dressed too sharply for our neighborhood, wearing a fitted blazer despite the heat, and he was standing much closer to her than she appeared comfortable with. Emma's smile looked strained. She kept shifting backward, clutching a small paper bag against her chest, while the man continued talking as if he hadn't noticed her discomfort. I slowed my steps. Part of me wanted to assume they knew each other and that it was none of my business. Then Emma glanced toward the parking lot, then toward the street, and finally toward the store entrance with the unmistakable expression of someone silently looking for a way out. Her shoulders had tightened, and the hand holding the paper bag was trembling slightly. Without giving myself time to think, I changed direction and walked straight toward them. As I got closer, I heard the man insisting that they should catch up over dinner because it had been too long since they'd talked. Emma's voice remained polite, but there was a nervous edge underneath it as she repeated that she wasn't interested and needed to leave. He ignored the second part entirely. I reached her side before I had any actual plan, and instinct took over. I slipped an arm around the grocery basket in my hand, smiled as naturally as I could, and said, "Hey, Em, sorry I'm late. I've been looking everywhere for you." Both of them turned toward me. Emma blinked in surprise. The man frowned slightly. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could both hear it, but I forced myself to keep smiling. Then I added the sentence that changed everything. I promised my girlfriend I'd help carry the flowers home. For a single terrifying second, I thought Emma might stare at me in confusion and expose the lie immediately. Instead, something unexpected happened. Relief flashed across her face so quickly it was almost painful to see. She stepped closer to me, slid her free hand around my arm, and looked directly at the man beside her. Her voice was soft but steady when she spoke. I told you I was meeting someone. The man's expression darkened with irritation, and he looked from her hand on my arm to my face as if trying to decide whether to challenge the story. Emma stayed close enough that I could feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, I suddenly wanted the lie to be true far more than I should have. The man studied me for a long moment, the kind of look people give when they're trying to decide whether they've just been politely dismissed or publicly embarrassed. Up close, I noticed he was older than I first thought, probably early 40s, with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way simply by refusing to back down. Emma's grip tightened slightly around my arm, and that tiny movement told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't playing along for fun. She genuinely wanted this conversation to end. I kept my expression relaxed even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. The stranger finally forced a thin smile and asked how long we'd been together. It was exactly the question I had hoped he wouldn't ask. Before I could invent an answer, Emma spoke first. She gave a small laugh, looked up at me with surprising warmth, and said, "Long enough that he knows I can never choose flowers without changing my mind 3 times." I blinked, caught completely off guard by how naturally the lie came to her. The man glanced at the bouquet of white daisies in her paper bag, muttered something that sounded vaguely apologetic, and stepped back. He told Emma he hadn't realized she was seeing someone and suggested they might talk another time. Emma shook her head gently and said she didn't think that would be necessary. A few seconds later, he walked across the parking lot toward a dark sedan and drove away without looking back. The moment he disappeared around the corner, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Emma remained beside me, her hand still looped through my arm. For a heartbeat neither of us moved. Then she slowly released me and pressed a hand against her forehead. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't believe you just did that." I asked if she was okay. She nodded, though her face had gone noticeably pale. After a moment she explained that the man was Ryan, her former fiancé. She hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. Apparently he had recently moved back to town for work and had spotted her inside the grocery store. At first he claimed he only wanted to apologize for the past, but when she tried to end the conversation, he kept following her from one aisle to another, insisting they should have coffee and talk about what went wrong between them. Hearing his name attached to the painful story I'd heard during that thunderstorm made my stomach tighten with anger. I asked why she hadn't called someone. Emma gave a sad little shrug and admitted that she froze when she saw him. She said part of her still remembered the man she thought she was going to marry, and another part remembered exactly how thoroughly he had broken her trust. Before I could respond, she looked at me with eyes that were suddenly very serious. "Thank you for not walking past me," she whispered. "Most people would have." I told her the truth, I almost had. That earned a faint smile, the first genuine one since I'd approached her. To my surprise, she reached for my hand again, this time deliberately. Her fingers were cool from the grocery store air conditioning, and she held on as if drawing comfort from the contact. "Would you mind staying with me for a little while?" she asked. "I know the act is over, but I don't really want to be alone right now." There was no world in which I was going to say no to that. We decided to walk home instead of driving separately, and the afternoon that should have ended after a 5-minute rescue stretched into something unexpectedly gentle. We stopped at the bakery on Cedar Avenue for fresh sourdough bread, shared an iced coffee from the cafe next door, and wandered slowly through the neighborhood park where children were playing on the swings. The strangest part was how easy it felt. Emma kept close beside me, and every now and then our hands brushed naturally as we walked. Several people we knew waved from across the street. Mrs. Alvarez from the corner house smiled knowingly when she saw us together and called out that it was about time I stopped spending all my weekends working. Emma laughed so hard at my horrified expression that she nearly spilled her coffee. By the time we reached our apartment building, the tension from earlier had faded into a quieter kind of awareness, one that made me notice details I had spent months trying not to notice: the way sunlight caught the copper highlights in her brown hair, the tiny freckles across her nose, the softness that entered her eyes whenever she looked directly at me. We stopped outside our doors in the hallway, neither of us seeming particularly eager to say goodnight even though it was barely 6 o'clock. Emma leaned against the wall for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she smiled gently and said, "You know, for a fake boyfriend, you were surprisingly convincing." My mouth went dry. I managed a laugh and told her I'd had excellent motivation. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering that answer more carefully than it deserved, and for one dangerous second I had the unmistakable feeling that whatever had begun outside that grocery store was far from over. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma stepping closer to me in the grocery store parking lot, felt the pressure of her hand around my arm, heard the quiet certainty in her voice when she called me the man she was meeting. I kept reminding myself that it had been an emergency, that she had simply needed a safe exit from an uncomfortable encounter with her ex-fiancé, but my heart refused to treat it like a temporary performance. The next morning I woke earlier than usual and found myself listening for the sound of her apartment door opening across the hallway. Around 9, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Emma stood there wearing jeans, a loose blue sweater, and an expression that was equal parts hopeful and nervous. She held up a paper bag from the bakery we'd visited the day before. "I bought too many cinnamon rolls," she said. "I thought maybe you could help me solve that problem." I invited her in, and within minutes we were sitting at my small kitchen table drinking coffee while sunlight streamed through the window. The conversation started with harmless things: her students, my renovation projects, the terrible music playing in the bakery, but eventually the silence between topics grew softer and more comfortable than it had ever been before. Emma traced the rim of her coffee mug with her finger and admitted that seeing Ryan again had shaken her more than she expected. She said she hated that he could still make her feel uncertain after everything he'd done. I told her uncertainty didn't mean weakness. Sometimes old wounds hurt simply because they had once mattered. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. "You always know the right thing to say," she murmured. I almost told her that I only knew what to say when it came to her, but the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Instead, I asked whether she wanted to do something that afternoon to keep her mind occupied. To my surprise, she agreed immediately. We ended up spending the day at the community garden where several neighbors volunteered on weekends. Emma helped an elderly couple replant tomato seedlings while I repaired a broken wooden bench near the entrance. Working side by side felt strangely natural, like we had been doing it for years. More than once I caught other volunteers smiling at us with the unmistakable expression people reserve for couples who clearly belong together. Normally that would have made me uncomfortable. This time I found that I didn't mind nearly as much as I should have. Late in the afternoon, while we were packing up tools, Mrs. Patterson approached us. She was the 80-year-old widow who lived on the first floor of our building and considered herself the unofficial guardian of everyone under the age of 60. She announced that she was hosting a small birthday picnic the following Saturday in honor of her late husband, George, and that she expected both of us to attend. Before I could answer, she added with a satisfied smile, "And don't think I haven't noticed what's been going on between you two." Emma nearly dropped the gardening gloves she was holding. I started to explain that things were not exactly what they appeared to be, but Mrs. Patterson waved away my protest. "Nonsense," she said. "George used to say you can tell when two people feel safer standing next to each other than anywhere else in the world. That's how you two look." Then she handed Emma a handwritten invitation and shuffled off to speak with another volunteer. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Emma looked down at the invitation and laughed softly, though there was a faint blush in her cheeks. "I guess our performance is convincing the entire neighborhood now," she said. I expected her to suggest we clarify things at the picnic, but instead she looked up at me with that same playful spark I had glimpsed after the grocery store incident. "Would it be terrible," she asked carefully, "if we kept pretending for one more afternoon?" My heart gave a dangerous little jolt. I knew pretending was becoming increasingly risky because every hour I spent with her made the line between acting and wanting feel thinner than paper. Still, when she smiled at me like that, there was only one answer I could give. I told her I'd be honored to accompany my fake girlfriend to a picnic, and the look of relief and happiness that crossed her face made me wonder if perhaps I wasn't the only one starting to wish the word fake would eventually disappear. Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of warm summer breeze that made the whole neighborhood smell faintly of cut grass and charcoal grills. I spent far too long deciding what to wear for a picnic that technically wasn't a date, eventually settling on a clean navy button-down and jeans that didn't have paint or sawdust on them. Around noon, Emma knocked on my door, and the moment I opened it, every argument I had prepared about keeping emotional distance became completely useless. She wore a simple white sundress patterned with tiny blue flowers, her hair pulled back loosely except for a few strands framing her face, and she looked so effortlessly beautiful that I forgot what I was about to say. Emma held up a bowl covered with foil and smiled. "Pasta salad contribution," she announced. "Please tell me you remember the lemonade." I lifted the pitcher in my hand, and together we walked to the small park where Mrs. Patterson had reserved a shaded picnic area. The gathering was modest: half a dozen neighbors, a few grandchildren running around with kites, and a folding table covered with homemade food. But the moment we arrived, every pair of older eyes turned toward us with unmistakable satisfaction. Mrs. Patterson greeted Emma with a hug, clapped me on the shoulder, and loudly declared that she was thrilled we had finally stopped being so stubborn. Emma laughed and slipped her hand into mine before I could react, as if holding it had already become the most natural thing in the world. The contact sent a familiar warmth through my chest, but this time I noticed something new. She wasn't holding my hand because she was frightened or needed protection. She was holding it because she wanted to. Throughout the afternoon we fell into an easy rhythm that felt dangerously close to real couplehood. We served food together, chased a runaway paper plate across the grass, and listened to Mrs. Patterson tell stories about how George used to bring her daisies every Friday even after 50 years of marriage. At one point Emma wandered toward the edge of the park where a small pond reflected the afternoon sun, and I followed her. We stood side by side watching ducks drift across the water while the sounds of laughter and conversation faded into the background. After a quiet moment, Emma admitted that she hadn't felt this relaxed with another person in a very long time. I told her I felt the same, and the honesty in my voice made both of us suddenly still. Before either of us could say anything more, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, but the screen showed an unknown number. When I answered, a familiar male voice asked if Emma was with me. My stomach tightened instantly. It was Ryan. He said he had gone by her apartment earlier to apologize properly and wanted to know whether she would agree to meet him for coffee. I stepped away from the pond so Emma wouldn't have to hear his voice, but she had already recognized the name from my expression. When I ended the call, she looked shaken. "What did he want?" she asked quietly. I told her the truth. Emma stared out at the pond for a long moment, her arms wrapping around herself as if a cold wind had suddenly arrived. Then she looked at me with eyes that held fear, frustration, and something heartbreakingly vulnerable. "I thought seeing him again would remind me of what I lost," she whispered. "Instead it reminded me of how lonely I've been since then." The confession hung between us in the warm afternoon air. Without thinking, I reached for her hand. She turned toward me immediately, and before I could second-guess myself, I told her she didn't have to face him, or the past, or any of those old wounds alone anymore. Emma's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. She squeezed my hand tightly and took a small step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath when she spoke. "Then don't disappear when this pretending ends," she said softly. "Because I'm starting to think it stopped being pretend for me a while ago." In that moment, standing beside a quiet pond while our neighbors laughed somewhere behind us, I realized the truth I had been trying so hard to avoid. The lie I told outside a grocery store hadn't created feelings that didn't exist. It had simply given two frightened people permission to stop hiding feelings that had been growing quietly for much longer than either of us was willing to admit.